The letter that changed everything. The envelope arrived at Buckingham Palace on a Tuesday morning in September, addressed simply to His Majesty the King, private and confidential. It had been forwarded 3 times, first to the wrong department, then held in security screening, finally landing on the desk of the King's private secretary nearly a week after it was posted. Inside was a letter written in careful handwriting, accompanied by laboratory documents that would send shockwaves through the House of Windsor. The woman who wrote it was named Sarah Mitchell, 42 years old, a secondary school teacher from Somerset. She had spent her entire life believing her father was a naval officer who died before she was born. But when her mother passed away 6 months earlier, Sarah discovered a shoebox hidden in the attic, filled with photographs, letters, and a diary that told a very different story. A story about a brief relationship in 1982 between her mother, then a 19-year-old palace staff member, and a young Prince Andrew, fresh from his Falklands service and riding high on public adulation. The diary entries were explicit. Her mother had worked in the palace housekeeping department for 8 months. Andrew, 22 and notorious for his charm with staff, had noticed her. What began as flirtation evolved into a clandestine relationship conducted in palace corridors and borrowed apartments. When her mother discovered she was pregnant in early 1983, she made a decision that would define Sarah's life. She left palace employment without explanation, moved to Somerset, and never spoke Andrew's name again. The letter Sarah sent to the king was not a demand or a threat. It was a plea for truth. She had taken a commercial DNA test months earlier, hoping to learn about her heritage. The results showed matches to distant relatives with surnames connected to the royal family. Confused and desperate for answers, she commissioned a private laboratory analysis, comparing her DNA profile against publicly available genetic markers from authenticated royal sources. The probability of paternal lineage to Prince Andrew came back at 99.97%. Sarah Mitchell wasn't asking for money, titles, or recognition. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted to know if the man whose blood ran through her veins would accept that she existed, and she was giving the palace 60 days to respond before she made her story public. When King Charles read the letter that evening in his private study, accompanied by the DNA documentation reviewed by palace medical advisors who confirmed its apparent legitimacy, he sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes. His brother Andrew's scandals had already cost the family dearly, including the Epstein associations, the disastrous interview, and the settlement paid to Virginia Giuffre. The monarchy had survived, but barely. Now this, potential proof of an illegitimate child, conceived when Andrew was a serving officer, with a palace employee who would have been in an inherently unequal power dynamic. The implications were staggering. If confirmed, Sarah Mitchell was 9th in line to the throne, ahead of several of the king's own cousins. She had rights under succession law, regardless of her parents' unmarried status. More importantly, she was a living person whose existence had been denied for 40 years, who deserved better than becoming another royal scandal to be managed and buried. Charles made 2 phone calls that night. The first was to Prince William, who needed to understand that the family was about to face another crisis. The second was to Prince Andrew himself, who had been living in relative seclusion at Royal Lodge since his public fall from grace. That conversation, according to those briefed on it afterward, lasted 3 hours and ended with Andrew neither confirming nor denying Sarah's claims, but admitting he couldn't be certain about encounters from 40 years ago. The palace machinery went into motion. Discreet inquiries were made into Sarah Mitchell's background, not to discredit her, but to verify her story. Investigators confirmed her mother had indeed worked at the palace during the specified time frame. Employment records showed her abrupt resignation in February 1983. Sarah herself was born in October 1983, the timing consistent with conception during her mother's palace employment. The palace's legal team faced an unprecedented question. What was the ethical and legal obligation when confronted with credible evidence of an unknown royal heir? The easy answer would have been to demand that Sarah submit to palace-controlled DNA testing to verify the claim before acknowledgement. But Charles, haunted perhaps by his own family's history of cold pragmatism over human connection, took a different approach. He decided to meet her, The meeting was arranged with extraordinary secrecy, no official cars, no security detail that might attract attention, no palace venues. Instead, Charles met Sarah Mitchell in a private room at Highgrove, with only his private secretary present. Sarah arrived terrified, dressed in her best clothes, carrying a folder containing her mother's diary and photographs. Charles later described the encounter to William as looking into the eyes of someone who shares our blood and seeing only honest confusion and pain. Sarah wasn't angry or entitled. She was a woman who had discovered that her entire understanding of her identity was built on protective lies. She showed Charles pictures of her mother, a young woman with kind eyes who had made impossible choices. She shared diary entries where her mother wrote about loving someone she could never claim, about raising a daughter alone rather than subjecting her to scandal and rejection. At one point during their conversation, Sarah said something that would haunt Charles. "I don't want to be a princess. I just want to know if my father even cares that I exist." Charles couldn't answer that question. Andrew had refused to attend the meeting, claiming through intermediaries that he needed proper DNA verification before any acknowledgement. But Charles could see what Andrew couldn't or wouldn't. This wasn't about legal liability or succession complications. This was about a daughter who deserved to know her father, and a father who had apparently created a life and then walked away, perhaps without even knowing, perhaps without caring to know. When the meeting ended, Charles made a decision that would define his early reign as either courageously transparent or dangerously naive. He told Sarah that the palace would facilitate independent DNA testing, using Andrew's confirmed genetic material from medical records. The results would be shared with her directly, not filtered through lawyers and press offices, and if the test confirmed what both already suspected, there would be a public statement acknowledging her existence and her place in the family. Sarah Mitchell left Highgrove that afternoon in a palace car, no longer an outsider making claims, but a woman whose story the king himself had chosen to believe deserved investigation and truth. The 60-day deadline she had given became irrelevant. The palace was moving forward on its own timeline, for its own reasons, not because Sarah had threatened exposure, but because Charles had decided that after decades of covering up inconvenient truths, the monarchy needed to face this one honestly. The DNA test was conducted within a week. The results came back exactly as the initial analysis had indicated. Sarah Mitchell was, beyond statistical doubt, Prince Andrew's biological daughter. The question now wasn't whether she existed, but what would be done about it. The reckoning. Prince Andrew learned the confirmed DNA results not from his brother, but from a formal letter delivered by the king's private secretary to Royal Lodge. The letter's tone was courteous but cold, conveying information rather than seeking input. The test confirmed Sarah Mitchell's paternity. A statement would be released within the week. Andrew's cooperation was expected, not requested. For a man who had spent recent years arguing about his treatment by the institution he once served, this moment represented complete powerlessness. The decision had been made above him, around him, without him. Charles had effectively declared that Andrew's opinion on acknowledging his own daughter was irrelevant. The family would do what was right, regardless of Andrew's comfort or preference. Andrew's initial response, shared with the few people still willing to speak with him regularly, oscillated between denial and self-pity. He claimed not to remember Sarah's mother specifically, though palace records showed they had overlapped during a period when Andrew had been living at Buckingham Palace between naval postings. He insisted that if a relationship had occurred, he had no knowledge of a pregnancy. He suggested the entire situation was orchestrated to humiliate him further, to extract money, to damage what remained of his reputation. But the DNA didn't lie, and Charles wasn't interested in Andrew's rationalizations. The king had reviewed the case files, read the mother's diary entries, and most importantly, met Sarah herself. This wasn't a shakedown or a tabloid setup. This was a daughter who had been denied knowledge of her father, and a father who had either not known or not cared to know that he had created a life. The palace communications team drafted and redrafted the statement, each version attempting to balance honesty with dignity, acknowledgement with damage control. The challenge was enormous. How do you announce that a prince has an illegitimate daughter without either seeming callous toward her or soft on Andrew's behavior? Prince William, who had been consulted throughout the process, advocated for directness. "The public is tired of palace euphemisms," he told the communications team during one particularly tense strategy session. "Say what happened. He had a relationship. There was a child. We didn't know. Now we do, and we're acknowledging her. Anything less looks like we're still covering up." Catherine, present for many of these discussions, added a crucial perspective. "How do we want our children to remember how the family handled this? Do we want them to see that when faced with an uncomfortable truth, we hid it? Or do we want them to learn that even difficult acknowledgments matter more than protecting images?" Their input shifted the approach. The statement would be clear, factual, and carry an implicit apology, not for Sarah's existence, but for the decades she spent not knowing the truth. It would position her not as a scandal, but as a family member who deserved recognition and welcome. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell's life had been suspended in surreal limbo. Since meeting King Charles, she had been asked to maintain absolute confidentiality, to tell no one about the DNA test or the impending announcement. She went to work teaching history to 14-year-olds, stood in front of her class discussing Tudor succession, and couldn't tell anyone that she was about to be confirmed as a legitimate descendant of the very royal family she taught about. The palace arranged for Sarah to have legal counsel and a media advisor, both paid by the royal household, to help her navigate what was coming. They prepared her for the attention, the scrutiny, the immediate transformation of her life from private obscurity to public curiosity. They also facilitated a second meeting, this time with Prince Andrew himself. That meeting, held at a neutral location and monitored by palace officials, was by all accounts excruciating. Andrew arrived defensive, his body language closed, his words carefully limited. Sarah arrived hopeful, still believing that perhaps this man, who was her biological father, might show some emotion, some regret, some interest in who she had become. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Andrew asked factual questions about her life, her education, her work, and her circumstances, but showed little emotional engagement. When Sarah tried to ask about his memories of her mother, he deflected. When she shared that she taught history and had always been fascinated by the royal family, without knowing she belonged to it, he managed only a tight smile. Near the meeting's end, Sarah asked the question that mattered most. "Do you want any relationship with me? Or is this just about legal acknowledgement?" Andrew's response, remembered by everyone present, was devastating in its emotional emptiness. "I think it's best if we let the palace manage expectations about what this relationship will entail. I have limited public capacity now, and I wouldn't want to promise something I can't deliver." Sarah left that meeting understanding that while she had gained confirmation of her father's identity, she had not gained a father. Andrew had offered her nothing. No apology for the unknown years, no expression of regret about her mother's struggles, no curiosity about the granddaughter Sarah had from her own marriage. He had given her a biological fact without a human connection. When Charles learned how the meeting had gone, his frustration with his brother deepened. "She didn't ask to be born," he told William afterward. "She didn't create this situation, and Andrew can't even manage basic human decency toward her." William's response was more pointed. He spent his entire life taking what he wanted without considering consequences. Why would he start caring about them now? The statement's release date was set for the following Monday. Sarah was informed on Friday, giving her a weekend to prepare for her life to change irrevocably. The palace offered her security protection, which she declined. They offered to relocate her temporarily, which she also refused. She wanted to face what was coming from her own home, in her own community, as herself. On Sunday evening, Charles made one final call to Andrew. The conversation was brief, ending with Charles saying something that would be repeated among palace staff for months afterward. "Tomorrow, we acknowledge what you should have acknowledged 40 years ago. How you choose to handle it from here will define what little legacy you have left." The statement was released at 10 a.m. on Monday morning, distributed simultaneously to all major media outlets, and posted on official royal social media channels. It read, "Buckingham Palace confirms that following recent DNA analysis, Sarah Louise Mitchell of Somerset has been determined to be the biological mother of the royal baby, daughter of Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Ms. Mitchell was born in 1983 to Catherine Mitchell, who was briefly employed in the royal household. Prince Andrew was unaware of Ms. Mitchell's existence until recently. The royal family welcomes Sarah and looks forward to building a relationship with her. She will be afforded appropriate security considerations as a member of the extended royal family. No further details will be provided to respect Ms. Mitchell's privacy. The world exploded. The storm. Within minutes of the statement's release, Sarah Mitchell's name was trending globally. News helicopters circled her Somerset home. Reporters camped outside her school. Her photograph, pulled from social media and teaching credentials, appeared on front pages from London to New York to Sydney. The woman who had spent 42 years in comfortable anonymity was now among the most discussed people on Earth. The public reaction split along predictable lines. Sympathy for Sarah dominated among younger demographics and women who saw in her story a familiar narrative of men escaping consequences, while women bore them silently. Criticism of Andrew intensified, with commentators noting that he had managed to create a child with the same apparent carelessness he had shown in his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. Royal watchers debated the succession implications, though constitutional experts quickly clarified that while Sarah was technically in line to the throne, her position was distant enough to be largely ceremonial. But the most intense reactions came from those asking why the palace had acknowledged Sarah at all. Conservative royalists argued that the statement was unnecessary, that privately confirming paternity would have sufficed, that subjecting the family to another scandal served no purpose. Charles is supposed to protect the monarchy, wrote one prominent royal commentator. Instead, he's volunteering its dirty laundry for public consumption. These critics missed what Charles understood. The story was coming out regardless. Sarah had given the palace 60 days before going public. By moving first, by controlling the narrative through honest acknowledgement, Charles had neutralized the exposé element. There would be no tabloid exclusive, no tearful interview with Sarah claiming rejection, no palace denial followed by DNA proof. The truth was out on terms that positioned Sarah as family rather than scandal. Still, the media's appetite was insatiable. Sarah's neighbors were interviewed. Her colleagues at school gave carefully neutral statements. Distant relatives who barely knew her sold exclusive stories about her childhood. Paparazzi captured her leaving her home, her face pale with stress, declining to comment. The palace arranged for Sarah to issue a brief written statement through their communications office. "I am overwhelmed by the attention and ask for privacy as I process this life-changing confirmation. I am grateful to His Majesty the King for handling this with sensitivity and look forward to getting to know my extended family in time. I remain committed to my work as an educator and hope to return to my normal life as soon as possible." The idea that she could return to normal life was, of course, impossible. Sarah Mitchell would never teach history again without students whispering about her royal connection. She would never walk through her village without being recognized. She had been transformed, against her will and by accident of birth, into a public figure. Meanwhile, within the royal family, the revelation created unexpected divisions. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense pragmatism, reportedly told Charles she approved of his handling. "Better to acknowledge reality than to spend years in denial," she said. "Heaven knows we've had enough of that." But other family members were less supportive. Some resented that Andrew's mess was once again dominating headlines during a period when the king was trying to establish his reign's identity. Others worried about precedent. If one illegitimate child was acknowledged, how many others might emerge claiming royal parentage? Prince William navigated this tension by focusing on Sarah herself. He reached out through back channels, offering to meet her when the immediate media storm subsided. His message, conveyed through the king's office, was simple. "You didn't choose this. Neither did my mother. I understand something about navigating a role you didn't ask for while the world watches. When you're ready, I'd like to talk." That gesture, made without fanfare or publicity, would later be revealed and praised as evidence of William's emotional intelligence and his understanding that Sarah was not an adversary or a problem, but a person deserving of dignity. Catherine, too, quietly advocated for Sarah within palace walls. During family discussions about how to manage the ongoing situation, she pushed back against suggestions that Sarah be kept at arm's length. Prince Andrew conspicuously remained silent. He released no statement, gave no interviews, and made no public appearances. His lawyers issued a brief comment confirming that he acknowledges the DNA results and wishes Ms. Mitchell well, a phrase so devoid of warmth that it generated its own wave of criticism. Sarah's daughter, Emma, became an unexpected subplot in the story. At 19, she suddenly found herself with royal lineage, her grandfather a prince. Unlike her mother, Emma embraced the attention initially, giving an interview to a glossy magazine about what it meant to discover your kind of royal. The interview was generally sympathetic, but her youth and candor created challenges. She posted photos on social media with captions like, "Guess I'm technically a lady now," that some found charming and others thought inappropriate. The palace gently intervened, offering Emma the same media training they provided to minor royals, helping her understand that casual social media use would now be scrutinized and sometimes weaponized. Emma, to her credit, listened and adjusted, locking down her accounts and declining further interviews. 2 weeks after the announcement, Sarah received an unexpected invitation. Afternoon tea at Kensington Palace with Princess Catherine. No press, no protocol officers, just two women talking. Sarah accepted, terrified and hopeful. That meeting remained private, its contents never officially disclosed. But those who saw Sarah leaving later described her as visibly emotional, carrying a small gift bag that turned out to contain books for her classroom, personally selected by Catherine. Whatever was discussed in that sitting room, Sarah emerged with something she hadn't had before, an ally within the family. The palace's strategy became clearer over the following weeks. Rather than treating Sarah as a problem to be contained, they were slowly integrating her into the family's peripheral orbit, not as a working royal, that was never the intention, but as an acknowledged relative with whom the family maintained an appropriate connection. She was invited to private family gatherings, but not public events. She was given access to genealogical records and family history, but not royal titles or allowances. She was welcomed, but not thrust into the spotlight. This calibrated approach reflected Charles's fundamental decision. Sarah deserved acknowledgement and connection, but that didn't mean subjecting her to the full weight of royal duty. She had lived 42 years as a private citizen. That life could continue, now simply with the knowledge and limited connection to her biological family. But Andrew's silence continued to fester. As weeks passed without any personal outreach from him to Sarah, public opinion turned increasingly harsh. Commentators noted the cruel irony. Andrew had spent years complaining about how the institution treated him, yet he couldn't extend basic human decency to his own daughter. His reputation, already damaged beyond repair, sank further into ignominy. The truth about power. 3 months after the DNA announcement, Sarah Mitchell sat for her first and only television interview. It was carefully negotiated with a respected journalist, editorial approval over the final cut. The palace neither endorsed nor discouraged the interview, recognizing that Sarah had the right to tell her own story, but offering guidance on potential pitfalls. The interview aired on a Sunday evening and drew massive viewership. Sarah came across as thoughtful, articulate, and refreshingly honest about the strangeness of her situation. She spoke about her mother with evident love, explaining that while she wished she had known the truth earlier, she understood why her mother had protected her from a scandal that would have consumed her childhood. When asked about Prince Andrew, Sarah chose her words carefully. "I think he's a man who doesn't know how to connect with the consequences of his past. I've given up hoping for a relationship. Biology doesn't create family, choice, and effort. He hasn't chosen me and I won't force it." That answer crystallized public sentiment. Sarah wasn't demanding recognition or money. She wasn't bitter or vengeful. She was simply acknowledging reality. Andrew had given her genetic material but nothing else, and she had made peace with that emptiness. The most powerful moment came when the interviewer asked what she wanted people to understand. "I want people to know that the women who work in palaces, who serve these families, have lives and dignity that matter. My mother wasn't a scandal or a mistake. She was a teenager in an impossible power dynamic with a prince who could do what he wanted without consequences. That's not romance, that's the reality of how power works." The interview's impact was immediate and lasting. It reframed the narrative from royal scandal to structural power imbalance. Think pieces proliferated about workplace dynamics, consent in unequal relationships, and how institutions protect powerful men while women bear costs alone. Andrew, who had remained silent, found himself at the center of renewed criticism, not just for this specific situation, but as a symbol of aristocratic entitlement and consequence-free behavior. Within the palace, the interview created an unexpected conversation. Younger staff members, particularly women, resonated with Sarah's framing. They saw in her mother's experience echoes of dynamics that, while less extreme, still existed. The subtle ways power and position created pressure, made saying no difficult, blurred the lines of genuine choice. King Charles, watching the interview, reportedly said to his private secretary, "She's right, and we need to be better." That acknowledgement led to a quiet but significant policy review, updating workplace conduct standards, strengthening reporting mechanisms for inappropriate behavior by royal family members, and training on power dynamics for all staff. Prince William went further. He requested a meeting with Sarah, not at a palace, but at a neutral location of her choosing. They met at a cafe in Bath, William arriving with minimal security, sitting down across from the woman who was, bizarrely, his first cousin, and yet a complete stranger. Their conversation, later partially described by William in an authorized biography, focused less on Andrew and more on their shared experience of having their identities shaped by circumstances beyond their control. William talked about the burden of being Diana's son, of growing up with the world telling him who his mother was, often getting it wrong, never being allowed to grieve privately. Sarah talked about growing up without a father, building an identity on a lie, and then having that identity exploded by truth. "We're both," William said, "figuring out how to be ourselves when the world keeps trying to tell us who we should be." That meeting marked a turning point. William became Sarah's informal advocate within the family, the person who ensured she wasn't forgotten in the institutional churn. He invited her to small family gatherings where her presence wouldn't attract attention. He facilitated connections between her daughter Emma and some of his cousin's children, creating peer relationships that might help Emma navigate her unusual situation. Catherine supported this integration fully. She understood, perhaps better than anyone except William, what Sarah was experiencing: the sudden scrutiny, the constant second-guessing, the way private people respond to suddenly being public property. She invited Sarah to charity events she patronized, not as a public statement, but as a quiet signal: "You're welcome here." Meanwhile, Prince Andrew remained isolated, his position within the family increasingly untenable. The DNA revelation and his subsequent coldness towards Sarah had effectively ended any possibility of rehabilitation. He was no longer just a scandal-prone prince. He was a father who couldn't acknowledge his own daughter with basic human warmth, who had created life and walked away, who embodied the worst stereotypes about aristocratic irresponsibility. Charles faced growing pressure, particularly from William, to formally remove Andrew from any remaining royal privileges. The argument was straightforward. Andrew had no public role, no charitable work, no redeeming contribution to the institution. His continued residence at Royal Lodge, his retention of titles, his access to security, all of it looked increasingly indefensible. The decision came 6 months after the DNA announcement. Andrew would retain his Duke of York title for life. Stripping it would require parliamentary action and create more controversy than benefit. But he would vacate Royal Lodge, moving to more modest accommodation on the Windsor estate. His remaining patronages would be permanently withdrawn. His security would be reduced to minimal protection, and he would receive a final message from his brother. If he wanted any role in the family's future, he needed to start by properly acknowledging his daughter. Andrew's response to this effective exile was predictable. He complained about being unfairly persecuted, about being punished for something that happened decades ago, about the family's lack of loyalty, but his complaints fell on deaf ears. The institution had finally run out of patience with a prince who took everything and gave nothing. Sarah, learning of these changes through palace channels, felt conflicted. She hadn't wanted to cause this upheaval and hadn't sought Andrew's punishment, but neither could she deny a certain grim satisfaction that consequences delayed by 40 years had finally arrived. The new normal. 1 year after the DNA announcement, Sarah Mitchell's life had found an unexpected equilibrium. She still taught history. The school, after initial media chaos, had rallied around her with protective loyalty. She still lived in Somerset, though she had moved to a slightly larger home when the paparazzi presence made her original cottage untenable. She had not become a working royal or pursued any commercial opportunities from her newfound fame. What had changed was subtler. She now knew her full history, had access to medical records that explained hereditary conditions she'd wondered about, and could answer her daughter's questions about identity and heritage. She had also gained something unexpected, limited but genuine relationships with some members of her biological family. William and Catherine had become, if not close friends, then at least cordial relatives who remembered her birthday, invited her to occasional private gatherings, and made sure she knew she was part of the extended family. Princess Anne, typically brusque, had sent Sarah a surprisingly thoughtful letter about managing unwanted attention and offered practical advice about media management. King Charles met with Sarah quarterly, in conversations that were formal but increasingly warm. He seemed to view her as a test of his own values. Could he embody the compassion and honesty he claimed to value, or would he default to the institution's historical instinct to manage and contain? With Sarah, he chose compassion. Prince Andrew predictably maintained his distance. He had sent a single letter to Sarah 8 months after the announcement, an awkward attempt at connection that felt more like an obligation than a genuine interest. Sarah had responded politely but made no further effort. She had accepted that her biological father would never be an actual father, and she was at peace with that absence. The broader implications of Sarah's acknowledgement rippled through the monarchy in unexpected ways. The palace's transparent handling of the situation, while initially controversial, was increasingly viewed as a mature response to an uncomfortable truth. Charles's reign was being defined, in part, by his willingness to address problems directly, rather than hiding behind palace walls and public relations. This approach influenced how the family handled other sensitive matters. When historical records revealed other potential instances of royal family members behaving inappropriately toward staff, the palace commissioned an independent review rather than claiming immunity from scrutiny. When questions emerged about palace diversity and inclusion, the response was substantive policy changes rather than performative statements. Sarah had inadvertently become a catalyst for institutional evolution. Her existence proved that secrets eventually surface, that denial only delays reckoning, that treating people with dignity matters more than protecting images. The monarchy that acknowledged Sarah Mitchell was subtly different from the one that might have hidden her, more accountable, more human, more willing to admit that even princes make mistakes and should face consequences. For Sarah personally, the most meaningful change came in smaller moments. Her daughter Emma, now 20, had developed a friendship with Lady Louise Windsor, who understood something about growing up adjacent to royalty without being consumed by it. They bonded over shared experiences of normal ambitions, university, careers, and relationships, while navigating unusual family contexts. Sarah herself found unexpected kinship with Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Both women had married or been connected to the royal family from outside, and both understood the challenges of navigating an institution that claimed to value you, while simultaneously making clear you didn't quite belong. Their conversations, conducted over occasional lunches away from palace settings, provided Sarah with insights and support she hadn't known she needed. The question of Emma's future remained open. At 20, she was still figuring out who she wanted to be, complicated by the bizarre fact that she was technically in line to the throne, despite having grown up in a modest home with no royal training. The palace had made clear that no pressure existed for her to take on royal duties, but neither were the doors closed if she wanted some connection to that world. Emma's current choice was to pursue a completely normal life, university, career aspirations in environmental science, and a boyfriend who found her royal connection more amusing than impressive. She used her grandmother's surname, Mitchell, and declined most interview requests. But she also attended occasional family events, gradually building relationships with cousins who treated her as family rather than curiosity. As for Prince Andrew, he had become a ghost in his own family, physically present at Windsor but emotionally and socially isolated. He attended no public events, maintained no royal duties, and lived a life of comfortable but empty privilege. Staff reported that he spent most of his time playing golf, watching television, and nursing grievances about his treatment. The cruelest irony was that Andrew could have emerged from the DNA revelation with some dignity if he had simply shown his daughter basic human decency. The public would have forgiven an ancient relationship, might have even appreciated honest acknowledgement and an attempt at connection. Instead, his coldness and self-pity had completed his transformation from scandal-prone prince to cautionary tale about what happens when privilege meets accountability. William, now firmly established as the future of the monarchy, spoke occasionally about his cousin Sarah in interviews, always with respect and warmth. "She handled an impossible situation with dignity," he said in one profile. "She could have been bitter or demanded things she was entitled to. Instead, she just wanted the truth and minimal connection. That grace reflects better on her than our institution's historical handling of these situations." Those words mattered. They signaled that the next generation of royals understood something previous generations had resisted: acknowledging mistakes, treating people humanely, and admitting when the institution had failed, someone were not weaknesses but strengths. The DNA test that confirmed Sarah Mitchell's paternity had been a moment of truth for more than one person. It revealed a daughter to a father who didn't want to know her. It exposed an institution's historical comfort with covering up inconvenient realities. But it also demonstrated that change was possible, that transparency could coexist with monarchy, that even ancient institutions could evolve when led by people willing to prioritize humanity over image. Sarah Mitchell taught history to teenagers, lived in Somerset, and remained fundamentally herself, despite the revelation that she was a princess's first cousin, a prince's daughter, a king's niece. Her ordinary extraordinariness was perhaps the most revolutionary thing about her story. She proved that royal blood didn't have to mean royal life, that connection could be chosen rather than imposed, that family was defined by actions rather than genetics. In the end, the most powerful statement wasn't the palace's official announcement or Sarah's television interview. It was the quiet way she continued living her life, teaching, parenting, building relationships with the relatives who chose to know her, and letting go of the one who didn't. She had wanted truth and acknowledgement. She got both, along with something she hadn't expected: a place, however small and self-determined, in one of the world's most famous families. The royal family that acknowledged Sarah Mitchell was imperfect, still learning, still carrying the weight of centuries of mistakes, but it was also finally willing to admit when it had gotten things wrong, to correct course, to choose truth over comfortable fiction. That willingness, more than any crown or title, might be the legacy that mattered most. What began as a letter seeking truth became a catalyst for change. Sarah Mitchell asked only for acknowledgement and received a place in history. Prince Andrew's silence speaks louder than any statement, but the real story isn't about scandal. It's about a monarchy learning to face consequences instead of hiding from them. Sometimes the bravest thing a family can do is simply tell the truth. What royal secret do you think should be revealed next? Comment below and subscribe for more untold royal stories.